She was Marcus Aurelius's firstborn daughter. She wore the title of Empress before she turned 15. She had laid a husband in the ground who had once governed half the civilized world. She had carried in her womb the bloodlines of 3 separate Caesars. Inscriptions bearing her name were chiseled into temple walls from the deserts of Syria to the foggy edges of Britannia. And on a still spring evening in AD 182, alone in a sea-locked villa on the cliffs of Capri, Lucilla froze as boots came thudding down the marble corridor toward her chamber. She knew. There was no confusion. She had grown up watching emperors die. She had grown up watching emperors order the dying. And she understood, in that exact second, that her brother had finally signed her name onto a list. The officer waiting outside her door was holding a folded parchment, a single line, a single seal, the crimson wax pressed with the ring of Commodus himself. That order would not stop at her own throat. It would travel into the next room, where her little girl was sleeping with her cheek pressed to a pillow. Cassius Dio was a Roman senator. He lived through every step of this. He sat in the chamber. He watched the verdicts. He heard the screaming in the streets. And it was Dio who marked this exact night as the breaking point. The moment everything tipped. The moment the emperor stopped being a man and started becoming a monster. But to understand how the daughter of the philosopher-emperor ended up trapped on a windswept island, counting footsteps and waiting for a blade, you have to rewind a few months. You have to go back to the morning she chose to gamble her entire bloodline on one knife. Lucilla was not some quiet widow living off a pension. She was the single most powerful woman alive in the Roman world. Governors of distant provinces sent her flattering letters and waited weeks for a reply. When her father coughed his last breath in a military tent on the Danube in AD 180, she was already a widow. She was already an Augusta. She had already outlived rivals and conspirators that history forgot to even name. And then her little brother inherited everything her father had spent 20 years bleeding to defend. Commodus was 19, soft, pampered, completely unprepared for the weight of empire. She watched him walk away from the unfinished northern campaigns to chase pleasure inside the marble walls of Rome. She watched him hand the levers of the state to swindlers and flatterers while he stood on a raised platform shooting ostriches with arrows like a child at a carnival. She watched him sign death warrants for men whose only sin was holding eye contact a second too long. And in AD 182, Lucilla did the unthinkable. No Augusta before her had ever attempted it. She put gold behind a conspiracy to end her own brother's life. She quietly bought the loyalty of senators. She slid a dagger into the trembling hand of her young lover, walked him to the mouth of the amphitheater where Commodus would pass, and slipped back into the shadows to wait for the sound of the empire changing hands. That sound never came. The instant Quintianus stepped into the torchlight, lifted the blade, and shouted the words Lucilla had drilled into his memory for weeks, his courage abandoned him. One pause, one flinch, one heartbeat of hesitation. That was all it took. The Praetorians swarmed him. The knife clattered onto the dirt. And before nightfall, Commodus had every name, every senator, every conspirator, every lover, every cousin, the whole list ripped out of Quintianus piece by piece in a torture chamber beneath the palace. What came next was not a clean execution. It was theater. It was a calculated, public, grotesque performance of revenge meant to terrify every senator and every general who had ever even imagined defying the throne. And the manner in which Lucilla finally died on that lonely cliff in Capri, listening to her own daughter take her last breath through the wall, broke something inside Commodus that no surgeon could ever repair. That single night unlocked the next decade of madness, a 10-year spiral of paranoia, blood, and delusion that would only end when his own naked body hit the wet floor of a bathhouse, with a wrestler's hands wrapped around his throat. Before we walk deeper into the marble corridors of Rome, drop a comment right now and tell me which city and country you are watching from. Take a moment to subscribe and support the project. You are watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The wind tearing off the Tyrrhenian Sea slams into the white limestone of Capri with a sound like cracking ribs. It is the spring of AD 182. The villa perches at the lip of the cliff, a labyrinth of marble corridors and mosaic floors built generations earlier by emperors whose names now exist only on the lips of tutors and the chisels of stonemasons. Once, this island was a sanctuary, a pleasure ground. Tiberius himself ruled the entire civilized world from these exact rocks, transforming Capri into a fortified hideaway for his appetites and his terrors. Now the same villa serves a darker function. It is no longer a sanctuary. It is a holding cell with a view of the sea. Deep inside the eastern wing, behind layered doors of carved oak, a woman sits upright on the edge of a bed. She is not sleeping. She has not truly closed her eyes since the imperial guards came for her in Rome weeks earlier, since they ripped the Augusta sash from her shoulders, since they marched her across the marble of her own villa and pushed her onto the deck of a southbound galley like cargo. Her name is Annia Aurelia Galeria Lucilla. She is 33 years old. She is the eldest surviving daughter of Marcus Aurelius, and she understands, with the surgical calm of a woman who has spent her entire life dissecting the anatomy of Roman power, that this island is the last room she will ever stand in. She listens. The wind, the far-off detonation of waves against rock, the faint creak of cypress trees in the garden below. And then, cutting through all of it, a different sound. A wrong sound. The dull, identical hammer of iron-soled sandals striking polished stone. It is not the lazy patrol of a local watchman. It is not the shuffle of a servant. It is the synchronized, drilled cadence of praetorians. Men who answer to one man and one man only. The man sitting on the Palatine Hill. Lucilla does not cry out. She does not weep. She does not crawl under the bed. She turns her head toward the door that connects her chamber to the adjacent room, where her young daughter, Plautia, lies curled beneath a wool blanket, breathing the deep, unbothered breath of a child who still believes the world is safe. Lucilla understands, in this exact heartbeat, that her brother did not send an exile order. He sent a knife. The shadow of a centurion stops on the far side of the heavy oak door. The silence that follows is the longest silence of her life. To understand how the brightest jewel of the Antonine dynasty ended up in a sea-walled prison, waiting for a blade in the dark, you have to peel away the layers. You have to walk past the marble busts and the philosophical scrolls of her father. You have to see, with cold eyes, what it really cost to be born a woman too close to the throne. 20 years earlier, Lucilla owned the planet. She arrived in the world in AD 149, dropped directly into the high noon of human civilization. The Pax Romana had reached the peak of its arc. The empire stretched from the mist-soaked hills of Caledonia to the scorched stones of the Syrian desert. The Mediterranean was, in practice, a private Roman lake, and at the summit of this enormous machine sat her father, Marcus Aurelius. The world would later remember him as the philosopher emperor, the stoic sage scribbling meditations by candlelight in a campaign tent. But for Lucilla, that man was something colder. He was the architect of her future. In imperial Rome, a princess was not a child to be loved. She was an instrument, a piece on a board, a treaty written in flesh and blood, ready to be signed wherever the frontiers cracked or wherever a dangerous general needed to be leashed. Lucilla was 11 years old when her father played his first card with her name on it. He pledged her to his co-emperor, Lucius Verus. The math was cold, and the math was correct. Marcus Aurelius was the mind of the empire. He needed Lucius Verus to be the right arm. The Parthians had stormed across the eastern border, butchering Roman legions in Armenia and threatening the gold-rich cities of Syria. Lucius Verus was dispatched to crush them, but distance corrodes loyalty. Marcus knew that a victorious general at the head of half the Roman army might begin to wonder why he was sharing the purple with anyone. So he chained Lucius to the family. He gave him his own daughter. At 14 years old, Lucilla was loaded onto a galley and shipped across the Mediterranean to Ephesus. There, beneath the marble columns of the great temple, surrounded by foreign ambassadors and sweating legionaries, she became the wife of a man more than twice her age. She did not just become a wife. She became Augusta, the highest title a woman could hold inside the Roman world. She was Empress. Coins were struck in mints from Lugdunum to Antioch bearing her young profile. Provincial cities built shrines to her honor. When she crossed the streets of Antioch, the richest jewel of the Eastern Empire, the crowd hurled flower petals at her sandals. A sacred flame was carried in procession before her wherever she walked, a flickering announcement that this woman moved with the blessing of the gods themselves. She watched her husband run the Parthian campaign from the cool shade of his villa. She tasted, for the first time, the strange and intoxicating drug of absolute power. She sat at the edge of council chambers where grown men decided whether a city would live or starve with a flick of a wrist. She learned the truth that her philosophical father had buried under layers of stoic prose. Empires are not run by ideas. Empires are run by gold, steel, and quietly disposed bodies. But the eastern frontier was hiding something the legions could not stab. When the Roman armies finally cracked the gates of Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, they marched home with chests of looted silver, columns of slaves, and something invisible riding inside their lungs. The Antonine Plague. It announced itself as fever. Then came the convulsions, the violent dry coughing, the black pustules erupting across skin like a constellation of sin, the internal bleeding that turned the breath of the dying into a stench survivors never forgot. It scythed through the army camps. It rode home with the soldiers along every trade road. It hit Alexandria. It hit Athens. It crawled up the Tiber and into Rome itself. The streets clogged with the dead. Carts groaned through the night, stacked high with rotting corpses, the drivers binding wet rags across their faces to filter the sweet smell of decomposition. The empire wobbled, and in the cold winter of AD 169, the sickness finally caught Lucilla's husband. Lucius Verus was riding in a carriage near the northern town of Altinum, when something inside his skull simply burst. The chroniclers suggest the plague had thinned him out, weakened the vessels, primed him for the stroke. He died 3 days later, eyes half open, mouth twisted to one side. Lucilla was 20 years old. In the span of a single afternoon, she stopped being the wife of a reigning emperor and became something far more dangerous. A young, wealthy widow carrying the bloodline of the dynasty. In the Roman political marketplace, that made her a loaded weapon. Any senator ambitious enough to marry her would instantly hold a credible claim to the throne. Marcus Aurelius understood this with brutal clarity. He did not allow his daughter to grieve. Before the official mourning was even cold, he marched her into a second wedding. The man he chose for her was Claudius Pompeianus, capable, honest, a career officer who had bled across half a dozen frontier wars. But to Lucilla, the choice was a slap delivered in front of the entire empire. Pompeianus was not royalty. He was not even from a senatorial bloodline. He was an equestrian from the dusty provinces of Antioch, older, with weathered hands and a face cut by old campaigns. Marcus Aurelius selected him precisely because Pompeianus could never, under any reading of Roman law or Roman tradition, dream of seizing the throne. The marriage was a chemical agent designed to neutralize her. She resisted. She begged. Her mother, the Empress Faustina, fell at her husband's feet, pleading on her behalf. None of it moved him. The philosopher king signed his daughter's life away to the old soldier. Lucilla kept the title of Augusta on paper, but the fire that had once burned in her chest cooled into something harder, something patient, something resembling a long, slow blade being sharpened in private. For the next decade, she endured. She trailed her father and her new husband to the frozen marshes of the Danube frontier. While Marcus Aurelius scribbled his stoic reflections by lamplight, Lucilla stood at the edge of the camp and absorbed the unedited reality of the Marcomannic Wars. She saw Roman legionaries hack Germanic warriors apart in the mud. She saw severed heads hoisted onto pikes outside the palisades to warn the next village. She learned the most important lesson of her life. Survival, at this altitude of power, demands patience, ruthlessness, and the calm willingness to let other people bleed for your safety. And from that same vantage point, she watched her younger brother grow into a man. Commodus was the chosen one. He had been born in the purple, raised inside the palace, surrounded from infancy by flatterers who called him divine before he could even lace his own sandals. Lucilla saw the rot inside him long before anyone else dared to. While their father lost sleep over supply lines and frostbite, Commodus spent his hours watching gladiators train, drinking sour wine with men who had no business inside the imperial tent. The boy had no discipline. He had no curiosity. He had no fear of consequence. What he had was a bottomless ocean of vanity and a thread of cruelty that he hid behind a wide, dimpled smile. But he was the only surviving son. The empire was a birthday gift waiting under his pillow. In March of AD 180, the architect of the Roman world finally cracked. Marcus Aurelius died inside the military camp at Vindobona, on the doorstep of what would one day be called Vienna. The official record blames illness, perhaps a returning wave of the plague, perhaps a stomach ulcer that finally tore through the wall of his gut. He bequeathed an empire to a teenager. The transfer of power was instantaneous. The imperial ring slid from a dead father's cooling finger and onto the warm hand of a 19-year-old. Lucilla stood there in the crowd and watched Commodus address the legions, promising them gold, promising them victory, promising them eternal glory. She knew, before the speech was even finished, that every syllable was a lie. Within months, he proved her right. He walked away from the northern wars. Their father had spent 10 brutal years freezing in the mud to secure those borders, draining the imperial treasury to break the Germanic tribes. Commodus signed a hasty, embarrassing peace, ordered the imperial court packed, and rushed home to Rome. He missed the baths. He missed the arena. He missed the warm sun and the worshipping crowds. When he made his entry into the capital, he rode in a triumphal chariot, waving like a returning conqueror. even though he had returned nothing but lost ground. Riding beside him sat Cyoteris, a freedman chamberlain who had inserted himself into the young emperor's inner circle with the patience of a parasite. The Senate watched in horror as the new emperor openly draped his affection on a corrupt palace servant, ranking him above the scarred generals who had spent decades holding the empire together. For Lucilla, the return to Rome was the start of a slow, public humiliation. When her father was alive, her status as the former empress and the eldest daughter guaranteed her the front seat at every theatrical performance, the first position in every religious procession. But Commodus was a married man now. His wife, Brutia Crispina, was the reigning empress. The protocols of Roman court life were merciless and immovable. The sacred flame that used to precede Lucilla in public ceremonies was reassigned. It now flickered ahead of Crispina. When the imperial family entered the amphitheater, Lucilla was forced to walk one full step behind her teenage sister-in-law. When the games began and the sand drank up the blood, Lucilla was directed to the secondary chair. To a modern viewer, a seating chart sounds petty. In ancient Rome, the seating chart was everything. Power in this city was visual. It was choreographed. If the public saw you slip into the background, your influence dried up overnight. Senators stopped seeking her counsel. Provincial governors stopped sending her flattering letters. The gravitational pull of the empire shifted away from her and locked itself onto a teenage girl and her unstable husband. Lucilla was 32 years old. She carried the blood of 3 emperors. Her mind was sharper than anyone currently breathing inside the Palatine Palace, and she was being scrubbed out of the picture in slow motion. Erasure was only the opening move. Lucilla studied how Commodus governed. He did not govern. He performed. He drained the treasury to stage colossal gladiatorial spectacles, butchering thousands of exotic animals shipped in from Africa and India. Ostriches were beheaded with crescent-bladed arrows for entertainment. Elephants were speared from raised platforms. Panthers were shot down from elevated walkways where the emperor stood, safe and giggling. While the sand grew sticky with blood, the actual mechanisms of the state were handed off to men like Cyoteris. The Senate was reduced to background scenery. Anyone bold enough to question the emperor's spending or his strange new fascinations suddenly found themselves dragged in on accusations of treason. Wealthy patricians were executed for the simple crime of owning estates Commodus wanted to confiscate to fund his next spectacle. The atmosphere inside Rome turned poisonous. It was a wet, heavy paranoia that pressed on the chest. Men went to bed wondering whether the Praetorian Guard would kick in their doors before sunrise. Lucilla saw the math clearly. Commodus was not simply a bad emperor. He was a terminal infection wearing a laurel crown. If he stayed on the throne, he would burn the empire down brick by brick. And eventually, inevitably, the paranoia growing inside his skull would turn its eye toward her. Paranoia is a hungry animal. It never stops eating. Sooner or later, one of his advisors would lean in close and whisper that his older, smarter, more respected sister was a threat to the dynasty. It was not a question of whether she would be purged. It was a question of when. Lucilla made a decision in that quiet calculation. She was not going to sit politely and wait for the knock at the door. She was going to strike first. She began hosting small, carefully curated dinners at her villa on the edge of the city. Quiet meals, no musicians, no theatrical entertainment, just wine, low voices, and the right men. She invited senators carrying old grudges. She invited men whose family fortunes had been touched by Commodus's confiscations. She invited men whose pride had been sliced open by the new emperor's contempt. She did not utter the word treason. She spoke of her father instead. She spoke of the golden days of Marcus Aurelius. She spoke of how tragic it was to watch his legacy spat upon by his own son. She probed each guest, listening for the resentment beneath the polite agreement, looking for the man whose ambition outweighed his fear. She found her weapon inside a man named Ummidius Quadratus. He was young, rich, and politically wired into the right circles. He was also her lover. Her husband, Pompeianus, was kept completely outside the planning. He was too loyal to the memory of Marcus Aurelius to ever endorse a strike against the son. Quadratus, on the other hand, was starving for power. Lucilla fed that hunger with patient, surgical care. She wove a quiet web around him, pulling in disillusioned aristocrats one by one. Among them, crucially, was a senior officer named Tarutinius Paternus, prefect of the Praetorian Guard. The conspiracy assembled itself in the shadows like a clockwork bomb, ticking only an arm's length from the emperor's bedchamber. But every conspiracy needs the man who holds the actual knife. They needed someone willing to step out of the shadows, into the torchlight, and end the dynasty with his own hand. They found him in Quintianus. He was young. He was a patrician. He was the nephew of Lucilla's own husband. He was also arrogant, hot-tempered, and prone to theatrics. He despised Commodus with the kind of personal hatred that requires no rational explanation. Lucilla saw his volatility and turned it into a weapon. She handed him the assignment. She placed the dagger in his palm. The plan itself was elegant in its simplicity. It exploited the claustrophobia baked into Rome's ancient architecture. The amphitheater was vast, but the entrances were narrow, dim, and packed with bodies. The emperor was required to pass through a specific, poorly lit corridor on his way to the imperial box. The Praetorian Guard would be funneled into single file. There would be a moment of confusion, a jostle, a drop in visibility. That gap was where Quintianus would strike. He was instructed not just to kill Commodus, but to mark the killing. He was to shout a specific sentence in the moment the blade went in, transforming a private murder into a public political statement. "This is what the Senate sends you." Those were the words. Lucilla burned them into his memory across weeks of rehearsal. The assassination was supposed to be quick, public, and irreversible. With Commodus dead, the Senate would immediately ratify a successor. Perhaps Pompeianus, perhaps Quadratus. The name on the throne did not matter. Lucilla would be the hand inside the puppet. She would reclaim her fire. She would reclaim her seat. She would save Rome from the boy who wore her father's face like a stolen mask. But history is rarely clean. And the difference between an empire saved and an empire shattered often turns on a single hesitation, lasting no longer than a single beat of a single human heart. If you consider yourself a real student of the dark mechanics behind history, it is time to stop watching from the sidelines. I want to personally invite you to join The Lineage. This is our exclusive channel membership club. Joining The Lineage is not a tip in a jar. It is taking your seat inside the machinery that keeps this channel breathing. We refuse to hand you the sanitized school textbook version of the past. We dig into the mud, the blood, and the bone to surface the truth. That level of research costs real resources. When you become a member, you get early access to our documentaries, exclusive badges, and a direct line into the way these stories are built. If you are one of us, if you want these stories told with the weight they deserve, hit the join button below. Take your place inside The Lineage. The spring of AD 182 finally arrived. The games were announced across the city walls. Rome vibrated with the buzz that always preceded blood sport. Crowds spilled into the streets, shoving toward the amphitheater. The heat climbed. Vendors hawked watered wine and skewers of cheap meat outside the gates. Inside the palace, Commodus dressed himself in fresh silk, completely unaware of the Iron Point waiting for him in the shadows. He adjusted his laurel crown, gathered his retinue, and began the short procession toward the arena. Across the city, inside her quiet villa, Lucilla sat alone in a windowless room. The dice had already left her hand. There was no calling them back. She traced the rim of a silver cup with one slow fingertip, calculating in her head how long it would take for a runner to bring the news. She pictured her brother lying open-mouthed on the cold stone of the corridor. She pictured the screaming, the shoving, the sudden gorgeous vacuum where his power used to be. Meanwhile, inside the dark throat of the amphitheater corridor, Quintianus pressed his shoulder blades against the damp brick. He gripped the dagger hidden under his cloak. The metal was warm now, slick with the sweat of his palm. He could hear the roar of the crowd echoing through the arches overhead, distorted, almost animal. And then, beneath that wave of sound, something cleaner. The crisp, drilled, synchronized hammer of Praetorian sandals. The emperor was coming. The trap was set. Quintianus filled his lungs once, stepped clear of the shadow, and raised the knife into the torchlight. The sentence floated in the dead air of the stone corridor. "This is what the Senate sends you." Quintianus delivered the line with the swollen projection of a young actor on opening night. He pushed clear of the shadow and lifted the iron dagger above his shoulder. The blade caught the flickering orange of the oil lamps mounted along the brick. He had the emperor exactly where the plan required him. Commodus was unarmed. He was dressed in pale, ceremonial silk. His personal guard was momentarily jammed behind him, choked off by the sharp bend of the amphitheater passage. The angle was correct. The distance was short. The kill was a single forward thrust away. And Quintianus did not move. He stood there with his arm in the air, frozen by the sheer weight of what he was about to do. He was 20-something years old, staring directly into the eyes of a man worshipped as a living god from the British coast to the Euphrates. That one heartbeat of paralysis rerouted the entire future of the Roman world. The Praetorians did not freeze with him. They were veterans who had spent winters slaughtering Germanic warriors in frozen pine forests. They functioned on muscle memory and conditioned reflex. Two of them lunged before the emperor had even processed what he was looking at. They hammered into Quintianus, slamming his spine flat against the cold Roman masonry. The dagger left his fingers and clattered against the paving stones. The sharp metallic clang traveled down the tunnel, carried under the distant, swelling roar of the stadium crowd waiting for the games to begin. Commodus did not flinch. He did not back up. He simply lowered his gaze and stared at the weapon glittering on the floor. Then he raised his eyes to the young patrician now pinned to the wall by armored forearms, blood already running from his split lip. The emperor read the situation in full. The Senate had not delivered a petition. The Senate had mailed him a knife. He pivoted on the polished stone and walked back out of the amphitheater without a word. The games would continue. The emperor was finished playing. They dragged Quintianus across the city to the Castra Praetoria. This was the brick-walled headquarters of the Imperial Guard, sitting on the northeastern fringe of Rome, a sprawl of barracks, training yards, and subterranean holding cells that the average citizen never wanted to see the inside of. Under Roman law, a man of senatorial blood enjoyed enormous protections. He could not legally be struck by guards. He could not be tied to the rack. His body was theoretically untouchable. All of those rules dissolved into nothing the moment the charge became maestas. treason against the divine person of the emperor. When the throne itself was threatened, an aristocrat's blood ran the same color and the same temperature as everyone else's. The guards stripped Quintianus naked inside a damp, windowless cell. They bound his wrists to iron rings sunk deep into the vaulted ceiling. The light was a single oil lamp on a wooden table. History does not preserve the names of the men who took him apart. The Roman state kept specialists on staff for this kind of work. They were not sadists. They were technicians. They approached the human nervous system with the same cold professionalism a stonemason brings to a wall. They used heated metal. They used the flagrum, a multi-tailed whip braided with small lead beads designed to peel skin away from muscle in long, bright strips. They applied calibrated pressure to the joints of his shoulders and knees, working slowly. Quintianus was a young man. He had grown up drinking imported wine on couches stuffed with goose down. He carried none of the silent stoic endurance you needed to survive the cellars of the Castra Praetoria. He broke inside the first few hours. He started shouting names into the dark. He named the senators who had nodded in approval at the quiet dinner parties. He named the financiers who had whispered about bribing the prefects of the guard. He named his primary co-conspirator, Ummidius Quadratus. And finally, when the pain had stripped every last shred of dignity out of him, he named the woman who had placed the dagger in his hand. He gave them Lucilla. The sun had not yet finished sliding behind the 7 hills when the heavy boots came marching up the sweeping drive of Lucilla's villa. She was already waiting in the open atrium. She knew the assassination had failed. Information traveled through the underground slave networks of the city faster than horses could pound down the paved highways. She did not run. There was no place under the eagle's shadow where running mattered. She sat in a carved wooden chair near the central pool, dressed in the formal stola of a Roman matron, her back perfectly straight. Her husband, Claudius Pompeianus, stood awkwardly nearby in stunned silence. He had spent the afternoon working through dispatches from the northern frontier. He had no idea his own wife had just attempted to murder his emperor inside the bend of a stadium tunnel. The Praetorians did not knock. They drove the heavy oak doors off the hinges with their shoulders. Armored men flooded across the marble floor, hands resting on the pommels of drawn, short swords. The commanding officer did not bow. He did not address her as Augusta. He stood in the very center of her atrium and unrolled a parchment signed by Commodus. She was officially stripped of every imperial title she had ever carried. Her vast personal fortune, accumulated across a lifetime spent at the dizzy peak of the empire, was seized on the spot by the fiscus, the emperor's private treasury. She was placed under immediate arrest. Pompeianus watched the soldiers take his wife by the arms and lift her from the chair. He did not draw his sword. He did not object. He played the part of the loyal, oblivious old soldier with absolute conviction. That performance saved his life. He would survive the coming purge by quietly retreating to his country estates, complaining of failing eyesight, making himself so small and so pathetic that Commodus eventually decided he was not worth the cost of an executioner. Lucilla was loaded into a closed carriage. The thick curtains were lashed shut. She would never lay eyes on the streets of Rome again. Inside the Palatine Palace, something irreversible happened in the mind of Commodus. The attack confirmed every paranoid whisper his courtiers had ever planted in his ear. The Senate was not a partner in government. The Senate was a nest of pale snakes hiding under starched togas. He issued the execution orders before the night was out. Ummidius Quadratus was hauled from his bed by armed guards and beheaded in his own garden. Quintianus was dispatched inside his cell, the cleaning of the floor afterward likely taking longer than the death itself. The blood ran across the cobblestones, but the killing did not extinguish anything inside the emperor. It poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning. Commodus understood something dangerous about himself in those days. An emperor did not have to tolerate the aristocracy. He could harvest them. The purge expanded outward, far past the original list of conspirators. A swarm of professional informers, the delators, flooded Rome. Wealthy men who had never even shared a meal with Lucilla suddenly found themselves accused of treason on the basis of fabricated documents and bribed witnesses. The praetorians began arriving at villas in the dead hours of the night. These patricians were forced to open their own veins in steam-warmed baths or to drink hemlock under the steady gaze of their wives and children. Their estates, their gold reserves, their lucrative grain contracts with Egypt and Africa, all of it was vacuumed into the imperial treasury. Commodus then took that stolen wealth and funneled it directly into ever more spectacular gladiatorial games. He effectively forced the Senate to bankroll its own slaughter. Rome entered a kind of suspended terror. Men stopped speaking openly in the public baths. They stopped writing letters that could not survive a hostile reading. The entire political mechanism of the empire seized up, paralyzed under the boot of a 19-year-old who had just discovered, for the very first time, the unlimited horsepower of absolute power. Tarquinius Paternus, the cunning prefect of the Praetorian Guard, managed to slip past the first wave of executions. He had been a silent investor in the conspiracy, waiting to see whether the blade would land before committing his soldiers. When the strike failed, he scrubbed his fingerprints from the scene by aggressively prosecuting the surviving conspirators, performing the role of the loyal attack dog with relish. But paranoia is a very patient investigator. A few months later, Commodus pieced together the prefect's true involvement. Paternus was stripped of his command, arrested, and executed inside the same complex where he had once dictated orders. The imperial court turned into a slow, grinding machine. The men who replaced the dead simply queued up to take their own turn at the block. But Lucilla, against every expectation, was still breathing. Commodus hesitated to order her death on Italian soil. Despite her treason, she remained the eldest surviving daughter of Marcus Aurelius. The legions still worshipped the memory of her father. The common citizens of Rome still spoke of the Antonine Golden Age in the same tone they spoke about lost lovers. Executing her openly in the heart of the capital risked a riot in the streets, or something far worse, a legionary revolt in the rich eastern provinces where her image had once appeared on temple coins. Commodus reached for the traditional Roman toolkit when dealing with inconvenient royal women. Erasure through exile. He banished his sister to the island of Capri. The journey south was an engineered insult, designed to grind her down both physically and psychologically. The woman who had once traveled with elite cavalry outriders and a sacred ceremonial flame carried before her was now packed into a modest, unmarked wagon under heavy military escort. They rolled down the Via Appia, the great southern road, passing the tall marble tombs of her own ancestors in the long, dusty afternoon light. At the naval port of Misenum, she was transferred onto a small military skiff and rowed across the Bay of Naples. As the towering pale cliffs of Capri lifted out of the azure water, Lucilla understood, with surgical clarity, exactly what kind of place she was approaching. Capri was not a resort. It was a haunted house, wearing a beautiful face. More than 100 years earlier, the Emperor Tiberius had withdrawn to this exact island to flee the pressures of Rome. He had built the Villa Jovis, a colossal complex of terraces and chambers perched directly above a vertical fall into the sea. Tiberius had transformed the island into a private abattoir. Roman historians documented how the old emperor used to drag political enemies deep into the villa for interrogation, break their bodies with the same calibrated cruelty practiced in the Castra Praetoria, and then order his guards to hurl what was left off the cliff into the jagged surf 300 meters below. The local fishermen still pointed up at the sheer rock face and called the spot the Leap of Tiberius. This was the architecture of Lucilla's new prison. She was being locked inside the rotting masonry of another emperor's madness. For months, she existed in a state of enforced quiet. Her guards refused to speak with her beyond the minimum required to feed her. She received no letters. She had only her young daughter, Plautia, for company. They walked across the elaborate cracked mosaic floors of the half-abandoned villa, listening to the wind shriek through colonnades whose roofs had collapsed decades earlier. Lucilla spent her afternoons standing at the cliff edge, staring across the water at the faint blue smudge of the Italian mainland. She could see the thin gray smoke rising from coastal cities along the Campanian shore. She understood, with brutal honesty, that the empire was rolling forward without her. She had been deleted from the running record of Roman public life. Back inside Rome, Commodus was actively dismantling the foundations of the state. The administration of the empire was handed over to a man named Cleander, a former Phrygian slave who had clawed his way up through the palace staff. Cleander operated the government like an auction floor. He sold public offices. He sold provincial governorships. He sold military commands. He even sold patrician titles to wealthy merchants who had never set foot in the Senate. The Roman state became a corrupt open market. The silver denarius itself was debased, the precious metal content shaved down again and again to pay for the endless circus performances inside the arena. Commodus himself retreated deeper into something darker than mere arrogance. He began to swallow his own propaganda whole. He stopped dressing in the traditional toga of a Roman magistrate and started parading through the palace draped in the skin of a lion, dragging a heavy wooden club behind him. He declared himself the living reincarnation of Hercules. He demanded the Senate formally recognize his divine status. He issued a decree renaming the Eternal City itself, forcing the population to call Rome by a new name, Colonia Commodiana. The Senate, terrified of the rows of Praetorian swords standing behind the throne, voted unanimously to approve every delusion that crossed his lips. The empire was decomposing from the head down, poisoned by a ruler who had cut every remaining rope tying him to reality. Lucilla measured the slow, grinding passage of time by watching the seasons change across the water. The cool calm of spring rolled into the merciless heat of a Mediterranean summer, which slid in turn into a violent, storm-cracked autumn. She held on to a thin and very calculated hope. Inside the savage theater of Roman politics, exile was sometimes a temporary condition. Emperors fell. Usurpers climbed out of the provinces with legions behind them. If Commodus offended the wrong general, the legions on the Rhine or the Danube might decide to march south. If a new man seized the throne, he would need legitimacy in a hurry. And there was no cleaner way to buy the affection of the Roman public than by recalling the daughter of Marcus Aurelius from her island cage. All she had to do was stay alive, stay quiet, stay hidden. Outlast the boy in the lion's skin. But Commodus was not distracted. Paranoia is not a mood. It is a chronic, degenerative condition. It demands fresh fuel every single day. Every time the emperor stepped inside the amphitheater, every time he glanced up at the rows of senators sitting in their forced silence, his mind returned to that dark tunnel. The raised dagger, the shouted line. This is what the Senate sends you. The physical weapon had been knocked out of the hand that held it. But the architect of the strike was still walking and breathing somewhere on an island. As long as she existed, she was a banner that an ambitious general could one day decide to rally beneath. To really feel the psychological collapse of the Roman state during this period, you cannot lean on sanitized summary articles. You need to read the raw, unfiltered documentation produced by serious scholars. The primary backbone of the narrative we are unpacking today is a monumental piece of dark scholarship titled Commodus, An Emperor at the Crossroads by Olivier Hexter. This book is a brick of terror, dissecting in precise mechanical detail how a philosophical golden age slid into a blood-soaked autocracy. It is available right now through the View Products button on your screen. You need this text on your shelf if you want to truly understand the machinery of imperial power. Beside it on the digital shelf, you will find a curated selection of other immersive treasures and dark memorabilia built for serious students of antiquity. Open the shop shelf right now. Walk the vault. Secure your artifacts before we return to the cliffs of Capri. In the heart of winter, AD 182, Commodus sat alone inside his private quarters on the Palatine. He unrolled a large parchment map of the Italian peninsula across the surface of his desk. His index finger traced the jagged Tyrrhenian coastline down from Rome, past the curve of the Bay of Naples, and stopped on a tiny dot of land sitting just offshore. The conclusion settled inside his fractured skull with a kind of cold relief. Exile was a half measure. Half measures did not solve problems. A severed head, on the other hand, cannot plot a rebellion. He summoned his most trusted chamberlain. He dictated a single sentence onto a square of fresh parchment. He melted red wax along the bottom edge of the page and pressed his heavy gold signet ring deep into the cooling pool. Then he handed the rolled scroll to a veteran centurion of the Praetorian Guard. He gave the officer a fast ship, a small detachment of armed men, and a lethal mandate that required no court, no trial, and no judicial review. The order was absolute. The destination was the Villa Jovis. The objective was the total extinction of his own remaining bloodline. Back on the island, the winter storms had finally rolled past, surrendering to the deceptive, glassy calm of early spring. Lucilla sat alone in her dimly lit bedchamber, listening to the slow, regular breathing of her daughter through the connecting wall. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in through her nose. And then she heard it. The dense, synchronized impact of hobnailed sandals climbing the steep stone path up from the docks. The cadence was steady. The footsteps were not slowing. They were coming directly toward the heavy oak door of her wing. The heavy oak door of the bedchamber buckled inward. The iron hinges shrieked against the stone frame, and the sound traveled down the empty corridors of the Villa Jovis like a wounded animal. The centurion stepped across the threshold. He did not draw his sword. Roman military executions of high-ranking political prisoners, particularly women carrying imperial blood, almost never involved a blade. Splashing royal blood across the floor of a provincial villa was viewed as a kind of theological mess. The state preferred quieter methods. The officer carried a lacus, a tightly braided leather cord engineered specifically for strangulation. He did not speak. He did not read out a final decree. He did not offer her a moment to whisper to her gods. The Roman military apparatus did not deal in sentiment. It dealt in completion. Lucilla rose to her feet. She did not beg. She had been raised at the absolute summit of global power. She understood the engineering of a purge better than the man standing in her doorway. She had watched her father authorize the deaths of thousands of Germanic tribesmen without losing a minute of sleep. She knew that in the arithmetic of empire, her continued existence was a calculation error that her brother was finally erasing. The centurion looped the leather cord around her throat. He drew the two ends sharply outward, crossing his armored forearms behind her skull to multiply the force. The pressure crushed her windpipe instantly. The carotid arteries flattened, cutting the supply of oxygen to her brain. Her back stayed rigid for a few stubborn seconds before her nervous system unplugged itself. The eldest daughter of Marcus Aurelius collapsed onto the cold mosaic floor. The empire she had tried to rescue did not pause to mark the moment, but the mandate from Rome was not yet complete. The centurion stepped over the body and walked into the adjoining room. Plautia, Lucilla's young daughter, was still in her bed, half covered by a wool blanket. In a modern war, the execution of a child is recorded as an atrocity. In imperial Rome, it was standard political housekeeping. Bloodlines were the most dangerous weapons in circulation. If Plautia were allowed to live, she would eventually marry an ambitious general or a wealthy senator. She would carry the Antonine claim to the throne inside the marrow of her bones. Her future sons would be a living, breathing threat, lined up against Commodus for decades. The Praetorian Guard did not believe in loose ends. The child died in the dark. The bodies of the former empress and her daughter were not given a state funeral. They were not laid on a perfumed pyre or wept over by senators. They were almost certainly carried out to the lip of the limestone cliffs and dropped into the Tyrrhenian Sea, scrubbed from the physical world exactly as Commodus had ordered. When the courier finally reached Rome and confirmed the execution, the last thin dam inside the emperor's mind ruptured. The killing of Lucilla was supposed to bring him peace. It was supposed to amputate the central tumor of the conspiracy. Instead, it proved to him that absolute loyalty was a fairy tale. If his own sister, the woman who had shared his childhood meals at their father's table, had been willing to drive a blade through his throat, then every single human being inside the capital was a potential assassin sleeping behind a polite smile. Paranoia is a cancer that thrives on isolation. With Lucilla erased, Commodus had no surviving family member left to anchor him to anything resembling reality. The purge that had ignited in AD 182 mutated from a targeted political operation into a blind, sprawling, indiscriminate slaughter. His first target was his own wife. Brutia Crispina was the reigning empress. She had failed to produce a male heir, which made her politically disposable. But far more dangerous than her empty cradle, she was woven into the same aristocratic networks that had quietly funded Lucilla. Commodus accused her of adultery. It was the standard, unfalsifiable charge used to dispose of inconvenient Roman noblewomen. He divorced her, stripped her of the title of Augusta, and exiled her. The cruelty of his choice of destination was almost theatrical. He shipped her to the exact same island where her sister-in-law had died. Crispina walked the same empty halls. She looked out across the same vertical drop into the sea. And within months, another centurion stepped off another fast ship onto the docks of Capri. Crispina was strangled in the same fashion. Her body was discarded the same way. The imperial family was now openly eating itself. The terror metastasized into the Senate chamber. Commodus turned his attention next toward the Quintilli brothers, Condianus and Maximus. They were the most decorated military commanders of their entire generation. They had served Marcus Aurelius with absolute distinction on the frozen northern frontiers. They were also obscenely wealthy. Their family compound on the Via Appia was so enormous it featured its own private aqueduct, a private hippodrome, and a labyrinth of heated thermal baths the size of a small town. Commodus did not actually fear their military record. He coveted their address. He fabricated a charge of treason against the brothers. They were executed without trial, without testimony, without ceremony. The Praetorian Guard then moved into the villa itself. slaughtering their extended family, their clients, their tutors, their household slaves, sealing every possible mouth that might one day claim an inheritance. The emperor vacuumed their gigantic fortune directly into his personal treasury. The rest of the Roman aristocracy watched in silent horror. Wealth and competence were no longer assets. They had become death sentences with delayed activation. To manage the day-to-day machinery of an empire he no longer found interesting, Commodus elevated a man named Cleander. He was a freedman, a former slave from Phrygia, who had started his career carrying baggage inside the imperial household. Cleander understood his master with surgical clarity. He kept the silver flowing into the arena, financing the games, and in exchange the emperor handed him unconditional control over the Roman state. Cleander operated the government like a smiling, well-dressed criminal syndicate. He sold seats in the Senate for staggering sums of gold. He sold the verdicts of court cases before the trials had even begun. In a single calendar year, he appointed 25 separate suffect consuls, auctioning the highest office in the Republic to whoever could afford the bid. The civil administration buckled under the dead weight of pure, unchecked corruption. But the Roman mob tolerates corruption only as long as the grain keeps arriving. In AD 190, a savage famine slammed into the capital. The grain fleets out of Alexandria were delayed by storms and mismanagement. Bread prices spiked. The plebeians, hungry and furious, packed themselves into the Circus Maximus. A riot ignited like dry brush. The mob spilled out into the streets, marching toward the imperial estates beyond the city walls, screaming for Cleander's head on a pole. Cleander panicked. He ordered the elite equites singulares, the emperor's imperial cavalry, to ride down the unarmed crowd. The horses trampled citizens into the cobblestones. The urban cohorts, the city's paramilitary police force, broke ranks and sided with the starving mob, drawing their own swords against the cavalry. Rome was now in open street warfare against itself. Commodus, in the meantime, was lounging in a country villa, completely insulated from the slaughter unfolding miles away. When his mistress finally burst into his quarters and warned him that the mob was preparing to torch the palace, the emperor did not hesitate for a heartbeat. He did not defend his loyal minister. He ordered the Praetorian Guard to arrest Cleander on the spot. The freedman was beheaded. His severed head was mounted on a spear and paraded through the streets like a trophy to calm the crowds. Commodus took away the wrong lesson from that day. He concluded that the Roman people did not actually want governance. They wanted blood, and they wanted it on schedule. The final phase of the emperor's reign was defined by an open exit from human reality. Commodus stopped even pretending to function as a magistrate. He publicly declared himself the living incarnation of Hercules. He commissioned hundreds of statues to be erected across every province of the empire, each one depicting himself draped in the skin of the Nemean lion and gripping a massive wooden club. He decapitated the famous Colossus of Nero, a towering bronze figure that stood near the amphitheater, and ordered a new head bearing his own face to be welded onto the shoulders. He commanded the Senate to officially rename every month of the calendar after his own 12 adopted titles. August became Commodus. September became Hercules. He renamed the Roman legions themselves. He renamed the African grain fleet. He even attempted to rename the city of Rome, demanding that the capital of the world be known forever as Colonia Luciania Commodiana. The senators, descendants of the men who had defeated Hannibal and conquered Greece, were forced to stand in the Curia and vote unanimously in favor of erasing their own history. But the statutes and the decrees were no longer enough to satisfy the appetite gnawing inside him. Commodus needed to physically prove his divinity in the sand. He descended into the arena. He did not fight as an emperor observing the action from a velvet-lined box. He fought as a secutor, a heavily armored gladiator. He moved into the gladiatorial barracks. He trained alongside the professionals. When the games of AD 192 began, the emperor stood at the very center of the Colosseum. Over the course of 14 consecutive days, he methodically slaughtered hundreds of animals. He stood on a raised wooden platform, shielded by reinforced nets, and fired crescent-headed arrows into the necks of ostriches, decapitating the birds while they were sprinting at full speed. He killed elephants. He killed a rhinoceros. He killed a giraffe, an animal the Roman public had never even laid eyes on before, simply to watch the creature's long legs fold beneath it. Cassius Dio, the senator who chronicled this era, was seated in the front rows during these games. He recorded a single scene that captures the absolute degradation of the Roman state more clearly than any decree. After decapitating an ostrich, Commodus walked over to the section of seats where the senators sat. He held the dripping, severed head of the bird in his left hand. He held his bloodied sword in his right. He pointed the blade directly at the senators, smiling, silently broadcasting that their necks would be next on the list. Dio wrote that the senators were terrified, but the sheer absurdity of the moment made them want to burst out laughing. To hide the involuntary smiles from the emperor, the men of the Senate plucked laurel leaves from the victory crowns sitting on their heads and chewed them, keeping their jaws busy so the guards would not notice their expressions. The masters of the known world were chewing leaves to keep a madman from cutting their throats. Commodus did not confine his violence to animals. He ordered Roman citizens who had lost their feet to disease or accident to be roped together at the center of the arena. He dressed them as mythological monsters and clubbed them to death with his own hands. He fought human opponents in choreographed gladiatorial bouts. The opponents were issued wooden practice swords. He used live steel. He sliced the noses and the ears off his sparring partners as casually as a butcher trimming meat. Every time he fought, he charged the imperial treasury 1,000,000 sesterces as his personal appearance fee, effectively bankrupting the state to pay himself for his own atrocities. Rome was no longer functioning as an empire. It was a hostage crisis on a continental scale. The breaking point arrived in the final days of December, AD 192. The emperor announced his intentions for New Year's Day. He planned to march out of the gladiatorial barracks, fully armed as a secutor, and personally murder both of the newly elected consuls in front of the cheering public. He would then assume sole authority over the state directly from the arena floor. His inner circle finally accepted that the madness had reached terminal velocity. If they allowed him to carry this plan out, the legions in the provinces would revolt. The city would burn. Every man and woman who had ever stood close to the throne would be crucified along the highways. The core of the new conspiracy consisted of 3 people: Latus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard; Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain; and Marcia, the emperor's favorite concubine. Marcia was the catalyst. She had taken Crispina's place in the emperor's bed. She held enormous quiet influence, managing his schedule and his volatile moods like a stage director. On the afternoon of December 31st, while Commodus was resting in his private quarters, a small boy who roamed the palace freely picked up a wax writing tablet from the corner of the emperor's desk. The child carried it out into the marble hallway, playing with it, dragging his finger across the wax. Marcia intercepted the boy. She took the tablet from his hands, planning to slip it quietly back onto the desk, but her eyes caught the rows of scratched Latin text. It was a proscription list, a kill list. Commodus had written down the names of the people he intended to execute the following morning. The first name on the list was Latus. The second name was Eclectus. The third name was Marcia. She stared at her own death warrant. In that sterile marble corridor, Marcia experienced the exact same revelation Lucilla had experienced 10 years earlier. Proximity to power does not grant immunity. It only makes you a closer, easier target. She remembered the blood on the amphitheater floor. She remembered the purges. She remembered the daughter of Marcus Aurelius, strangled in the dark on a frozen island. Marcia understood, in that single freezing moment, that you cannot escape a Roman emperor. You either kill him or you die. She walked the tablet immediately to Eclectus and Latus. The three of them gathered in the shadows of the Palatine and agreed on a final, desperate strike. There was no time to recruit senators. There was no time to hire an assassin off the street. They had to do it themselves, and they had to do it before the sun came up. The plan was poison. It was the classic weapon of the Roman court, silent and untraceable. That evening, after Commodus returned from the arena, he went down to the palace baths to wash the sand and blood from his skin. It was his standing custom to drink a chilled cup of high-quality wine after bathing. Marcia prepared the chalice herself. She dosed the vintage with a heavy load of lethal toxins, most likely derived from monk's hood or hemlock. She walked into his private chamber, smiled at the man who had signed her execution order earlier that very afternoon, and handed him the cup. Commodus drank it down in long, thirsty pulls. He collapsed almost immediately. The toxins hit his stomach and triggered violent convulsions. But the emperor was, beneath everything else, an athlete. He carried the physical engine of a man who spent every day fighting and training. His body rejected the poison with brutal speed. He vomited violently onto the marble floor, expelling the toxic wine before it could be fully absorbed into his bloodstream. Marcia and Eclectus stood there in absolute horror. If he survived the night, all three of them would be on the rack before dawn. They needed a backup plan, and they needed a body to deliver it. They ran out into the corridors and found a man named Narcissus. He was a professional wrestler, a massive slab-shouldered athlete whom Commodus regularly used as a sparring partner and personal trainer inside the baths. Narcissus was, above everything else, a pragmatist. Latus and Eclectus offered him an enormous payment of gold and a guarantee of future political protection. They explained the situation in 3 sentences. The emperor was vomiting, weakened, completely unarmed, and entirely alone in the bathhouse. Narcissus accepted the contract without negotiating. The wrestler entered the caldarium, the hottest steam-saturated chamber of the thermal complex. The air was so dense with vapor it felt physical. Beads of condensation slid down the vaulted ceiling. Commodus was on his hands and knees on the wet tile floor, gasping for breath, his torso heaving as he tried to expel the last of the poison from his stomach. He was completely naked. He had no sword. He had no guards. The man who called himself Hercules, the tyrant whose word had killed thousands, was reduced to a trembling, vulnerable animal on the slick stone. Narcissus did not reach for a weapon. He did not need one. He grabbed the emperor from behind. He locked his thick forearms around the imperial throat, applying a textbook strangulation hold the way a craftsman applies a known technique. The emperor fought back. Even half-poisoned, he possessed the desperate strength of a dying man who still believed in his own divinity. His fingernails clawed into the wrestler's forearms. His bare feet skidded against the wet marble. But Narcissus was a professional. He dropped his weight low, planted his stance, clamped down on the carotids, and squeezed. The struggle lasted several long minutes inside the suffocating heat of the steam. The thrashing slowed. The emperor's eyes rolled back into his skull. The spine went limp. Narcissus held the grip for another 60 seconds to make absolutely certain. Then he released. The corpse of the most powerful man on Earth hit the wet tiles with a soft, heavy slap. The Antonine dynasty died on that floor with him. The golden age of the Roman Empire ended in a pool of steam and vomit. When the sun rose on the first day of AD 193, the news rolled across the capital like a wave breaking. The Senate, the same men who had been chewing laurel leaves and applauding him in the arena only hours earlier, erupted into a frenzy of vindictive joy. They passed a decree of damnatio memoriae. They ordered every statue of Commodus smashed into gravel. They ordered his name chiseled out of every marble monument from the wet hills of Britannia to the deserts of Syria. They declared him a public enemy of the Roman people. The conspirators wrapped the emperor's body in a cheap linen sheet and smuggled it out of the palace in the dark. He was not given a state funeral. The Senate wanted his corpse dragged through the streets with an iron hook and dumped into the Tiber River, the traditional disposal method for traitors and criminals. But Pertinax, the man the conspirators had hastily installed as the new emperor, intervened in the early hours. He allowed the body to be quietly buried inside the mausoleum of Hadrian, sealing the tomb behind heavy stone to prevent the mob from defiling the remains. The irony of history here is total. 10 years earlier, Lucilla had foreseen the exact trajectory of her brother's madness. She had understood, with surgical clarity, that the Roman state could not survive a narcissist holding unchecked power. She had organized a strike to save the empire, and when the strike failed, she had paid for it with her life, suffocating in the dark on the cliffs of Capri, while her daughter slept on the other side of a wall. 10 years later, his own concubine ran the exact same protocol, simply to save herself. The blade failed. The poison failed. But the bare hands of a wrestler in a steam room finally succeeded. Lucilla's diagnosis was vindicated by the blood and vomit on the bathhouse floor. She had been the first person to recognize that her brother was a monster. The rest of the empire needed 10 more years of corpses to finally arrive at the same conclusion. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. The algorithm runs on engagement, so if you want to see more content that refuses to sanitize the past, you need to subscribe right now. Hit the like button to push this documentary out to the thousands of history fans currently settling for mediocre history content. Drop a comment and share this video with somebody who needs to see the brutal reality of Rome. You have just watched another premium documentary from Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. The story does not stop here. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. It is your mandatory next step deeper into the shadows of antiquity. Click it, and we will see you in the next chapter.